Hello, I'm going to talk about the history of relations between Czech lands and Latin America, and I will focus on mutual context since the middle of the 20th century. I think it's an important part of issue, and because it's important to know about the tradition of contacts between our country, Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, and Latin America. Those contacts are rich and interesting. In the picture, you can see Ernesto Che Guevara visiting the tractor factory Zetor in Brno, Líšeň. The photo is from 1961. At that time, Che Guevara was the Minister of Industry of Cuba, and the revolutionary Cuba had very close ties with the communist Czechoslovakia. So it's a very characteristic image for the topic of today's lecture. I'm going to talk more about contacts with Cuba. This country played a key role in Czechoslovak politics towards Latin America after 1989. And on the other hand, we can observe after 1989 we can observe a radical change, radical turn. From being a great partner of Cuba, we became great critic of the Cuban government. This attitude towards Cuba is to some extent typical of Czech policy towards Latin America. Here are some examples of questions related to today's topic that may appear on the exam, and where are some significant historical data. The first signs of contacts between the two regions, Czech lands and Latin America, originate in the 16th century. As early as in the 17th century, missionaries, Jesuits, Franciscans from Czech lands were coming to the American continent. Economic ties in the form of trade with Czech glass date back to the 18th century. The popularity of Czech glass in Latin America is evident from 18th century. During colonial period, immigration of non-Spanish immigrants was prohibited, and after the declaration of independence in the 19th century, first groups of immigrants from Czech lands were arriving to Latin America. Czech professionals, especially brewers and experts in the sugar industry, sought employment in local breweries and sugar refineries. Following the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the 1918 and the creation of independent Czechoslovakia, the political representation of the new state tried to improve its position on the international scene by establishing diplomatic relations with countries around the world, including Latin America. The fact was motivated that the Czechoslovak economy was oriented to export, so it was necessary for Prague to look for the new market. So in the interwar period, Czechoslovakia established diplomatic relations with many Latin American countries and continued economic relations. Czechoslovakia exported machinery, industrial products, arms, textiles, consumer goods, and on the other hand, Czechoslovakia imported raw materials and agriculture products. After the Second World War, Czechoslovak-Latin American relations were affected by change to the international political scene. Czechoslovakia and Latin America found themselves on different sides of an increasingly divided world. During the Cold War, Czechoslovakia was under the influence of the Soviet Soviet influence from 1948. The Communist Party ruled in Czechoslovakia, and on the other hand, Latin America was under the influence of the United States. And Washington forced the countries of Latin America not to maintain contact with the communist world. Already in 1947, Chile severed diplomatic relations with Czechoslovakia. In the 1950s, in the 1950s, Venezuela and Peru followed. In all cases, the decision was justified by the affirmation that Czechoslovakia interfered in the inner affairs of these countries and attempted to spread the communist ideology. During the Cold War, Czechoslovak foreign policy wasn't independent. Instead, it was formulated in Moscow. In the period of the Cold War, the relationship between Czechoslovakia and Latin America reflected the relations of the Soviet Union with this area. So Czechoslovakia was part of the so-called Eastern Bloc or Soviet Bloc. These were the countries of Eastern Europe that were under the influence of the Soviet Union, except Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary. These were Soviet satellites that the autonomy of individual countries was limited. However, the Latin American position of Czechoslovakia within the Eastern Bloc was very special. Czechoslovakia wasn't only one of the most economically developed communist countries, but unlike the other countries of the Eastern Bloc, it had maintained close relations with Latin America in the interwar period, meaning that it had a wide network of embassies and trade with the region. So despite a limited autonomy of its foreign policy, Czechoslovakia was a relatively known brand in Latin America. Czechoslovakia was perceived differently at the beginning of the Cold War. The position of the Soviet Union and the other socialist countries in the region was visibly weaker than the position of Czechoslovakia. Therefore, in the 1950s and early 1960s, Prague helped other Eastern European countries whose positions in Latin America were not strong enough to open relations. Czechoslovakia also worked actively in other areas on the world. At the end of the 1940s, it provides arms and support to Israel, and in the 1950s it engaged strongly in the Middle East. In this respect, in the 1960s, this main focus of attention was Africa. Communist Czechoslovakia was very active in third world countries during the Cold War, so it's little known, but it's very fascinating story. During the Cold War, Latin America didn't play the important role in the foreign policy of the communist countries. Africa and Asia were more important in the foreign policy of the Soviet bloc. Latin America was considered a distant, hostile region under the influence of the United States. During the Cold War, Latin America was considered by the Eastern Bloc a region with very few possibilities for communist politics, and in this context, countries of Latin America were governed in most cases by governments which not only didn't support the communist ideology, but on the other hand saw a menace in it. Under the influence of Washington, anti-communism played an important role in the politics of Latin American countries. On the other hand, Latin American countries didn't deny trade with communist bloc. So it means that these countries would generally prefer business contacts to diplomatic contacts. The business exchange was therefore the main factor which was influencing the level and character of the mutual relations. In the period of the Cold War, Argentina was, together with Brazil, the most important business partner of Czechoslovakia in Latin America. In many Latin American countries, right-wing regimes were established until military dictatorships. These regimes maintained a hostile position towards the socialist camp. However, there were few special cases during the Cold War. A few leftist regimes were established in Latin America that were interested in working closely with the Soviet bloc. The clearest example is the Cuba of Fidel Castro. Another example is the progressive military government of Juan Velasco Alvarado in Peru. Most military regimes had a right-wing orientation, a US orientation. However, this government is something of an anomaly, a left-wing military regime that cooperated with the Soviet bloc. For example, Czechoslovakia supplied arms to Peru in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The Marxist government of the leftist coalition Unidad Popular, Popular Unity, led by Salvador Allende in Chile, is the third case. And the fourth example represents the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. In the photo is Daniel Ortega, one of the key people of Sandinista revolution and the current president of Nicaragua. The case of Cuba is the most important. Cuba had a specific position within the relations of Prague with Latin America. The Cuban Revolution in 1959 and the establishment of the socialist regime aroused the interest of the Eastern Bloc in Latin America. At the beginning, the orientation of the new Cuban government wasn't clear. Finally, Castro, under the pressure of external circumstances, sided with the Soviet Union. So the Soviet bloc played a very important role in the consolidation of the socialist regime in Cuba and greatly helped the Castro government to survive during the years of Cold War. In the 3 decades which followed after 1959, the year Fidel Castro assumed power in Cuba, Czechoslovakia was very active in the island. Czechoslovakia was part of the Soviet game to gain influence on the Caribbean island. Cuba, located close to Florida, close to US, was of particular strategic importance during the Cold War. In the photo you can see Fidel Castro during his visit in Czechoslovakia in 1972, and on this occasion he received the honorary doctorate from the Charles University, and met with President Gustav Husak. Initially, Czechoslovak products accompanied the export of the Soviet ideology, and later it became an essential part of so-called international assistance that the Soviet bloc provided to Castro regime. The economic cooperation with Cuba was very disadvantageous for Czechoslovakia. This cooperation mainly consisted of industrial equipment, weaponry. Czechoslovakia also provided Cuba with military experts, technicians, scientists. In the years 1960 and 61, it also secretly printed new banknotes, minted new coins, and transported them by sea to Cuba. And Czechoslovakia also played a specific role for Cuba in the international field. Indeed, when Washington broke diplomatic relations with Havana in January 1961, it was Prague which served as the representative of Cuban interests in United States and later in many Latin American countries. Czechoslovakia policy played a significant role in the consolidation of the Cuban regime. Given the strategic importance of the island, Prague maintained a highly political approach at the economic level. The needs of the Czechoslovak economy were not taken into consideration. For example, the main import from Cuba was sugar, although Czechoslovakia was one of the world's largest exporters of beet sugar. So the trade balance was considerably unbalanced, and the Cuban debt to Czechoslovakia was growing. Today, Cuban debt represents the important issue of mutual relations. Cubans have no resources to pay the debt and offered to pay it with Cuban round. So the Czech government rejected the offer, and there is still no solution. Our policy towards Cuba changed dramatically after 1989. Current relationship between Cuba and Prague are very tense. I will talk about this matter later. So for now, we stay in the 60s. As you know, that Cuba wanted to export its revolutionary model to several countries in Latin America, in the Third World, supported several guerrilla movements. Cuba was the center of the Latin American revolutionary left. It supported the armed struggle against local governments in order to liberate them from the political, economic influence of capitalism, imperialism, from the influence of the United States. During the 1960s, Latin America's revolutionary left was heavily dependent on financial and logistical assistance from Cuba. However, the efforts made by Castro's regime to promote its revolutionary model and support local left-wing movements were significantly disrupted by the island's diplomatic isolation. In 1961, USA and subsequently several Latin American states cancelled diplomatic relations with the Cuban government, and many countries in Latin America were dependent on the United States economically, politically, and under pressure of Washington. They broke their relations with Cuba. In January '62, Cuba was expelled from the Organization of American States, and in October of the same year, as a consequence of the missile crisis, logistical isolation also deepened. So as you know, the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 was a direct and dangerous confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and was the moment when the two superpowers came closest to nuclear conflict. And as a result, Cuba faced a blockade, and their links with the island were restricted, and it was practically impossible to travel to Cuba from American continent. So the Cuban government had a serious problem to solve: how to connect Cuba with the world, how to continue with the import of the revolutionary model, and so how to continue with the military training on the island, how to connect Cuba with the world. Cuba remained dependent on the assistance from Soviet bloc countries in many ways, including the help that it received to support the Latin American guerrilla insurgencies. In the 60s, Cuba's politics were autonomous in the political line. The Soviet Union didn't sympathize with Cuba's policy to support the guerrilla groups. It's important that Moscow wasn't in favor of armed struggle. The vision of Moscow was to follow step by step and to win electorally. That occurred in Chile in 1970, for example. So despite numerous political conflicts, the Soviet Union didn't want to lose its position of influence on the island. And the Soviet Union was very tolerant towards Cuba, and not only tolerant, as I said, the Eastern Bloc helped Cuba in various matters. And one of concessions of the Soviet bloc was logistical support for its revolutionary policy, with Czechoslovakia being the key player. Why Czechoslovakia? After the missile crisis, one of the few ways of leaving Cuba was via airlink to Prague. The Havana-Prague air connection, the first between Latin America and the socialist camp, was launched in April '61. The connections with Latin America ended under the pressure of the United States, and Prague was the only air connection with Havana during the 1960s. And by the end of the 1962, this link became the basis for an intensive logistical cooperation between the Czechoslovak and Cuban secret services that would have extraordinary regional and global significance. If someone from Latin America wanted to do military training or simply visit Cuba, it was necessary to go through Prague. So the route was, for example, Montevideo, Paris, Prague, Havana, and back. So in the 1960s, thousands of Latin Americans traveled between Prague and Cuba by air, many of them being engaged in anti-government armed struggles in the region after returning to their home countries. So, with the establishment of the line to Cuba, it could be said that Prague became the second capital after Havana of the Latin American revolutionary venture in the 1960s. Thousands of people, an important part of which consisted of experienced guerrilla leaders, guerrilla commanders, were traveling between Cuba and Latin America via Prague. As it's well known, the symbol of the armed struggle, Ernesto Che Guevara spent some time in Czechoslovakia between March and July 1966, after his unsuccessful mission in Africa, in Congo. However, the Cubans organized his stay without consulting the Czechoslovak party, meaning that Czechoslovakian sources, archive sources, don't reveal any details on this trip. So in the photo you can see the house where Che Guevara lived. It's in Ladví, about 30 kilometers south of Prague. The logistical support clearly shows how a small island country had a major influence on Soviet and Czechoslovak policy through involving it logistically in its operation. So as I said, the Soviet leadership sought to avoid losing influence on Cuba and Czechoslovakia, which was subordinate to the Soviet Union's interests, was therefore forced to comply with Cuban demands. The logistical assistance reflects the Czechoslovakia's extraordinary importance in the global Cold War competition. In fact, from the beginning, the the approach of the Czechoslovak leadership to the whole issue was rather passive. The transfers were not considered very important. So this approach changed when some states officially complained about the Czechoslovak support for Cuban politics, and there was a threat of disrupting foreign trade, for example. The Czechoslovak involvement in transfers of partisans via Prague to Cuba and back significantly influenced the perception of the country in capitalist war in non-socialist countries. Czechoslovakia was perceived as a center of communist organizations, a supplier of arms to subversive groups, and a gateway for the transit of guerrillas. In this photo, you can see a propaganda against Czechoslovakia from 1960s that says "Don't trade with Red Czechoslovakia." At the end of the 1960s, the Cuban government began to question its policy. The Latin American guerrillas supported from Havana totally failed. They were violently repressed. Ernesto Che Guevara, major supporter of the policy of armed struggle, died in Bolivia. His death in Bolivia in October 1967 began convincing several Cuban leaders that armed struggle wasn't a viable means of building revolutionary alliances in Latin America. And in addition, the Cuban economy was in a critical state, so without the help from the Soviet Union, from the Soviet bloc countries, the Cuban socialist model couldn't exist longer. So it's for this reason that in August 1968, while communist parties in many socialist parties in many countries roundly criticized the Soviet Union during the invasion to Czechoslovakia, Cuba refused to condemn the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia, and by expressing his support for the Soviet Union in August 1968, pragmatism of Castro achieved a renewed improvement in relations with Moscow. So after 1968, Cuba became completely economically dependent on the Soviet Union, and this is reflected in a certain political approximation. A radical phase of Cuban politics ended, and Cuban support for the policy of armed struggle significantly decreased. In 1969, Soviet trade with Cuba began to increase dramatically, and within 4 years Cuba became a member of the Council of Mutual Economic Assistance, the Soviet dominated trading bloc of socialist countries. And Havana began to direct its attention to establishing business and diplomatic relations with Latin American countries rather than supporting revolutionary movements. The second example of the socialist government in Latin America represents Chile. Salvador Allende won the 1970 Chilean presidential election as a leader of the Unidad Popular coalition. It was a left-wing coalition, and became the first democratically elected president with radical Marxist orientation. And Allende began to carry out his platform of implementing a socialist program called La Vía Chilena al Socialismo, the Chilean path to socialism. In the course of the presidency of Salvador Allende, Chile became the second most important political but not economic partner of Czechoslovakia in Latin America after Cuba. The experience with Cuba instigated Soviet bloc to more pragmatic attitude. Soviet bloc countries no longer wanted to finance generously other leftist regime as it was in the Cuban case. And at the same time, Chile didn't have much to offer to the markets of Eastern Europe. Chile is the great producer of copper. However, the socialist field was buying copper in Africa. So this cooperation of Soviet bloc with Chile of Salvador Allende was limited by a series of factors. Allende was in very severe isolation, politically and economically, under the strong pressure of the United States, and it resulted in the coup and the fall of the left-wing government on the 11th September 1973. The military government was established under leadership of Augusto Pinochet, and Allende's government ended after less than 3 years, after 1,000 days. However, it's a very important phenomenon, the left-wing government in the Western Hemisphere, its radical economic reforms, the violent fall. Allende's death in the presidential palace, the installation of the military regime under Augusto Pinochet. It's emblematic moment in the Cold War, Latin American Cold War. 10 days later, 21st September 1973, after the coup, Soviet Union suspended diplomatic relations with Chile, as did the other countries of Eastern Bloc, including Czechoslovakia, because Chile wasn't of significant economic or strategic importance to the Soviet bloc, and there was too much propaganda value for communist countries in the Chilean coup. So soon afterwards, a massive campaign was launched in the communist countries, which presented Augusto Pinochet as an exponent of modern fascism, supported by the United States. It's also very interesting Cold War phenomenon. On the other hand, the Soviet Union made massive campaigns against human rights violations in the Third World, but at the same time the communist regimes violated human rights against their own populations. Augusto Pinochet was often regarded as the most brutal dictator of Latin America, despite the fact that this reputation was to a great extent unjustified and exaggerated. The number of victims of the Chilean dictatorship is about 3,000. However, the number of victims of the last Argentina dictatorship is about 40,000. The foreign policy of the Soviet Union and other communist countries was distinct towards the various military regimes and was guided by pragmatic interests. As Chile wasn't much significant economic or strategic importance, Moscow suspended relations with Pinochet regimes. On the other hand, the crimes of Argentina military junta were hardly mentioned because Argentina was an important trading partner. The Soviet bloc maintained relations with Argentina, dictatorship, military government of Brazil, etc. So these countries were of great economic strategic importance for Soviet Union. So the way in which the authoritarian regimes were for many years presented to the Czechoslovak public, Czechoslovak society, contributed to the difficulties of an objective analysis after 1982-89. The crimes of the Argentine military junta, as well as of other Latin American governments characterized by brutal repressions are still partly overshadowed by the controversial figure of Augusto Pinochet, who is seen as their symbol. At the same time, several right-wing groups in the Czech Republic and other post-communist countries started to acknowledge Pinochet as a president, politician who had saved this country from communism. For some anti-communists, the repressions of the military government are interpreted as a necessary evil or an indispensable part of the fight against communism. The neoliberal policy of the Pinochet government and its relative economic successes served as an example of several post-communist countries especially during the first half of the 1990s. Several right-wing politicians appeared in the Czech Republic and expressed their sympathy for Pinochet. For example, Václav Benda, a Czech dissident, was probably the biggest supporter of Augusto Pinochet. Also, it's interesting that Augusto Pinochet visited the Czech Republic in 1994. He came to negotiate a supply of weapons for the Chilean army. It was his first and only visit to a post-communist country. And the visit was extremely controversial, obviously, and there were protests against it. Pinochet's regime was associated with human rights violations, and despite certain economic successes of his government, it's very difficult to defend him and his policy. In the 1980s, the countries of extraordinary importance for Czechoslovak policy in Latin America, for political reasons, were two. The first, obviously, was Cuba, as the only socialist country of the continent with relations in the sphere of politics, economic culture, etc. And the second one was Sandinist Nicaragua. Sandinistas forcefully took power in July 1979 with the so-called Sandinista revolution, which is the so-called Sandinista revolution which ended the dictatorship of the Somoza family, which had been in power since the 1930s. And the Sandinist government had marked interest in cooperation in all areas with Eastern Bloc. The cooperation had often acquired the character of international help. However, cooperation was no longer as close or as intensive as in the case of Cuba. Economic pragmatism of the Soviet Union was already evident. The Soviet bloc was struggling with an economic crisis in the 1980s and was unable to provide generous support. Cooperation with Latin American countries during the Cold War was limited. The main partner was Cuba, where was a brief cooperation with Chile, Peru, and in the 1980s, Nicaragua. Now I would like to mention mutual relations with a focus on its culture dimension, because culture propaganda played a crucial role during the Cold War. Generally, it's possible to say that Czechoslovak music was well known in the Latin American countries, and to a certain degree also Czechoslovak cinematography, which was traditionally successful at Latin American film festivals. New Wave, the Czechoslovak cinema of the 1960s, and directors such as Miloš Forman, Věra Chytilová, Vojtěch Jasný, etc. And in some cases, the good name of Czech culture also helped achieve political and economic goals. Czechoslovakia was an important transit center, an imaginary bridge between the Soviet Union and Western Europe. And at the same time, it was a significant meeting point for Latin American intellectuals and their European colleagues. During the Cold War, many Latin American intellectuals who sympathized with communist regime, with left-wing regimes came to Eastern Europe. A large number of world-famous artists came to Czechoslovakia. Some of them left written testimonies about their visit. Here I want to mention only two cases. The first one is Jorge Amado. He remains the best known of modern Brazil writers, with his work having been translated into some 50 languages. And his work reflects the image of Mestiço Brazil and is marked by religious syncretism. In his hometown, Salvador da Bahia, where is a strong African influence. Jorge Amado was member of Communist Party in 1948. 1948, the party was declared illegal and its members arrested and persecuted. And Amado and his family were forced to seek political asylum, and the communist Czechoslovakia offered to help. So in 1949, the writer and his family arrived to Czechoslovakia, and Jorge Amado spent more than 2 years with his family in Chateau Dobříš. Dobříš is about 40 kilometers south of Prague. In the photo on the right, you can see Amado with his children. Sorry, on the left, and on the right is Amado in the library of the Dobříš castle together with his colleagues. Another Latin American author related to Czechoslovakia is Chilean poet Pablo Neruda. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1971. The Colombian novelist Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the famous Latin American writer, once called Neruda the greatest poet of the 20th century in any language. And Neruda had a strong bond with Czechoslovakia, visited Prague and other countries several times, and the bond is most clearly reflected in the pseudonym of that young poet chose in 1920s in response to his father's disagreement with his poetry career. So according to the most frequently mentioned version, he was inspired by the Czech poet Jan Neruda, the poet from the 19th century from Prague, and although this was probably not the case, the origin of the pseudonym is a bit of a mystery, and the Chilean poet himself avoided these questions all his life. In the photo you can see Pablo Neruda with President Zápotocký, the second communist president of Czechoslovakia, and on Neruda Street in Hradčín, in Prague. And in this photo is Neruda at the folk festival in South Moravia, in Strážnice, in 1951. On the other hand, there were also Czechs who traveled to Latin America since the 50s. Latin America had been popularized by travelers Jiří Hanzelka and Miroslav Zikmund. The Czech travelers traveled from Buenos Aires to Mexico, and during this trip of more than 2 years, they participated every week in Czechoslovak radio, where they shared their impressions with the listeners. And these experiences were described in several books. Maybe the most known is Behind the River is Argentina, but there are more books. Through the Cordillera, the great waters of the Iguazu, towards the Skull Hunters, Between Two Oceans, all these books are dedicated to Latin American reality. And all these works aroused a great interest in Czechoslovakia for the remote region. Hanzelka and Zygmunt were traveling around the world in Tatra car. In addition to the educational objectives, his trip, their trips, also had the role of propagating the Czechoslovak brand Tatra abroad. Now I want to say a few words about relations after 1989, after the fall of the communism. Because the fall of the communism, the end of the Cold War, opened a new period in many areas of life of Czechoslovakia, which, moreover, stopped existing. Two successor states were created in 1993, the Czech Republic and Slovak Republic. And from the point of view of the Czech foreign policy, Latin America is considered as a region of rather marginal importance, although there is a certain consensus of Latin America's political significance and the opportunity for export. Since 1989, the region has not been a priority of the Czech Republic's foreign policy. In fact, only few issues have seriously provoked political discourse, namely Cuba and Venezuela. Both countries have been targets of criticism by influential Czech human rights, non-government organizations, and the Czech diplomacy for a long time. As I said, Czech politics towards Cuba changed dramatically. During the Cold War, Cuba was the most important ally in Latin America, and since the 1990s, the Czech Republic is one of the greatest critics of the Cuban government. Apart from commercial issues, the Czech Republic didn't articulate its specific interests towards most of Latin American countries. In conclusion, common contacts are based on perspectives of economic consolidation and cultural collaboration rather than on common political issues. The human rights diplomacy is associated with the name of Václav Havel, the first democratic president of Czechoslovakia after 1989. Václav Havel visited Latin America in 1996, specifically Argentina, Chile, Uruguay and Brazil. He was the first Czech or Czechoslovak president to visit Latin America. The photo shows Václav Havel during his visit to Uruguay with Uruguayan President Julio Maria Sanguinetti. Havel's successor in the presidency, Václav Klaus, was also very interested in Latin America and visited Latin America several times. Václav Klaus speaks Spanish and has been going to Latin America regularly since the 1990s, when he was finance minister and prime minister. And his visit to Latin America is especially connected with the famous pen incident during his visit in Chile and the meeting with the Chilean president Sebastián Piñera. Unlike Havel and Klaus, the current president Miloš Zeman hasn't visited Latin America. In general, his foreign trips were mainly to the East, to China and Russia. On the other hand, some prominent Latin American politicians also visited the Czech Republic. Probably the most important was the visit of Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva in 2008. It was characteristic that this visit enjoyed minimal media interest. The Czech media didn't report on the visit of the presidents of the most important Latin American country. It shows the decline in interest in Latin America. And this decline in interest in Latin America was reflected also in a decline in diplomatic representation. 13 years ago, the Czechoslovak government began to close some embassies. 12 years ago. Concretely, Montevideo in 2009, Bogota in 2010, and Caracas 2011. The embassies were closed during the economic crisis, during the right-wing government, and embassies were not closed only in Latin America, in Africa, and several other countries. And the explanation was the enemy government of Chavez in Venezuela. In the case of Uruguay, it was argued that it's a small country and Buenos Aires is very, very close. At least in the case of Colombia, the closure was considered an error, and after 2 years in 2012, the embassy in Bogota was reopened. So currently, Czech Republic has embassies in several countries of Latin America, in 7 countries of Latin America: Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Cuba, Mexico, and Peru. Obviously, the most important part of the Czech foreign policy towards Latin America is the economic relationship. In many cases, these relations are based on the good reputation of the former Czechoslovak export to Latin America. For example, tractor Zetor, car factory Škoda, arm factory Zbrojovka, Czech Glass are well-known brands in Latin American countries. After reducing the number of prioritized countries in 2009, Argentina and Chile were crossed off the list of prioritized countries, and now there are only 2 key actors: Brazil and Mexico. So these 2 states are the biggest partner of the Czech Republic, but the extent of foreign trade still remains low. Less than 1% is the Czech foreign trade with Latin America. Less than 1%. The role of Latin America is marginal in the economic sphere. So, for example, although Brazil is the most significant trade partner of the Czech Republic in Latin America, Czech exports to Brazil accounted only for 0.2% of the total Czech exports. This image shows foreign trade with 3 countries between 2011 and 2015 with Brazil, Peru, and Argentina, and it's obviously that Brazil plays the most important role. The dates are older, but the situation is still similar. Brazil's position is dominant in terms of economic cooperation. The main challenge will be the approval of the agreement between the European Union and Mercosur. And cultural relations. What is important in this respect are contacts with Czech communities, namely those in Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay. In this sense, it's important to mention above all Argentina. It's estimated that more than 40,000 people with Czechoslovak roots came into Argentina, what makes, after the United States and Canada, the largest destination of Czechoslovak immigrations overseas so far. 2 most important centers of compatriotic presence in Argentina represent Buenos Aires and Roque Sáenz Peña, Chaco region, close to Paraguay. This image is from a compatriot magazine from 1921 and reflects the interesting fact that in the interwar period Czechoslovakia had more inhabitants than Argentina. Actually, Czech government sent Czech teachers to 4 places in Latin America, 2 teachers to Argentina, 1 to Paraguay, and 1 to Brazil. Roque Sáenz Peña is the Latin American city with the greatest presence of Czechs. The city is near the border with Paraguay. In the photos you can see the building of the Czechoslovak Association and statues of Masaryk and Stefanek. Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk was the first president of the independent Czechoslovakia, and Milan Rastislav Stefanek was the first minister of the defense. The Czech Republic has relatively strong expert coverage of Latin America, namely in comparison with Africa. It's interesting that there is a very small number of experts on Africa in Czech Republic. When it comes to Latin America, the situation is a little better. There are two Ibero-Americanist university departments in the Czech Republic. The first one is the Center of Ibero-American Studies at the Charles University in Prague. That was established in 1967. At that time, in the 60s, there was a great interest in Latin America, in the East Europe, and this center offers two-year master's degree program and PhD program in Ibero-American Studies. And it's a small center. The center studies first of all the history of mutual contacts, and the second is the university in Hradec Králové. However, the study in Hradec Králové is focusing more on political science. And in the photo is Josef Opatrný, the director ex-director of the Center of Ibero-American Studies in Prague, probably the most important Czech expert for Latin America. You probably know him from Czech media or Czech television. The issue of human rights is one of the main topics of the Czech diplomacy in Latin America. The country of priority interest concerning this issue is Cuba, and also Venezuela in recent years during the government of Nicolás Maduro. The Czech Republic supported Cuban dissidents through financing the various projects, mainly through grants on non-government organization. In the first place, People in Need Foundation. So Cuba is one of the key countries, together with Belarus, for the human rights and democracy. So it was a summary of the contacts between the country and Latin America. You can see the literature related to the topic. In case you have some more interest, you can read some of these works. Eventually we can talk about it, and I can recommend you something more specific, where is actually a lot of literature. For example, in English, the book of Tobias Ruprecht, Soviet Internationalism After Stalin, is really great work about contact between Latin America and the Eastern Europe during the Cold War. So thank you very much for your attention, and have a nice day.